Thank you. We can start the panel now. Can you hear me? Hello, everyone. Good night. I hope you enjoy. I hope you have been enjoying all the speaks in all the events in the ISTF conference. We are going to start our event called Building Partnership for Forest Restoration. This is an event. It's not hard enough. So yeah, okay, that's okay. My name is Gino Rivera. We're so glad to have you all here. Welcome to our event. So first of all, I just wanted to tell you that this event is co-hosted by both ISTF, the conference that you've been participating, and the Forest Dialogue, which is like the secretariat is based in Yale, in the Forest School at Yale's School of the Environment. But we are an organization from all over the world, which we're aiming to create dialogue, to create spaces where stakeholders from different parts of the world can share and comment on different topics on problematics related to forest. We have different initiatives. One of them has been the Restoration Initiative, and we have just ended out the Restoration Scoping Dialogue, which have been convened here in New Haven the past 2 days. About this initiative, about this dialogue, we're gonna share a little bit of the main outcomes in this panel that we want to share with all of you. So please let me introduce Laura. Laura is gonna give these introductory remarks for all of us to have a shared understanding of what restoration really is. So just to quickly introduce Laura. Laura is a postdoctoral associate at the Forest School at the Yale School of the Environment. She finished her PhD in the University of Minnesota, where she studied how nutrient addition impacts plant growth and survival in tropical forest restoration. With her research, she helps to build the bridge between basic and applied science in the context of tropical conservation and restoration. Laura has been involved in several conservation and restoration projects in Colombia, Costa Rica, and Panama. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you, Gino, and thank you all for being here. So during these past 2 days, as a dialogue, we were discussing a lot about restoration, but this afternoon we were hearing our panelists talking about how important tropical forests are and how their role with being global connectors in terms of climate connectors, and how they can help us with climate adaptation is crucial. So beyond that, these forests are also providing a lot of biodiversity. So 70% of the biodiversity we have is concentrated in the tropics, and also billions of our people are there. So these ecosystems are crucial, and we know that they are in danger, and also their diversity. So not just the forest, but also the people that live there. So given this context, we have these urgent calls from multiple governments and agencies saying, we have to do something. We have to protect the remaining ecosystems we have, and also with the ones that are degraded, we have to start restoring them. And we have these big challenges. We have to try to limit global warming to 1.5 C degrees, and also we have to restore 2 billion of hectares. To be able to accomplish this, we need governments to agree, we need academia, we need nonprofits, we need local communities, and we also need the private sector. And today we're going to be hearing from the private sector what are their perspectives and how they can contribute to be able to accomplish this big goal that is restoring 2 billion hectares of degraded forests. So I'm going to pass it to Lyndall.
Just to give a quick introduction to Lyndall. So yeah, Lyndall is a forest policy officer at the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. So we're going to leave the floor for Lyndall and all the panelists to start the panel. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Gino. Can you hear me okay? Yep. And thanks very much, Laura, for that great introduction to this incredibly important, complex and interesting topic. So today we're talking about building partnerships for restoration. And over the last couple of days, we've had two really wonderful, rich days considering that very topic, with a particular focus on the role of the private sector in restoration, and where the private forest sector might fit in and make the biggest impact and contribution towards those 2 billion hectares that Laura just told us about that need restoring. So with us today, we have 4 esteemed panelists who have been in the scoping dialogue over the last couple of days. So we have here today Sarah Price, who's the Director of Sustainability at Sappi. We have Kerry Cesareo, have I got that right? Who's the Senior Vice President for Forests at WWF. We have Ivone Namikawa, who's the Senior Advisor Forest Sustainability at Klabin. And we have Galudra, the Indonesian Country Director for RECOFTC. So welcome and thank you for joining us. So over the course of the last couple of days, as we considered this topic of the role of the private forest sector and restoration, we considered many aspects and the complexities of restoration, the complexities of having appropriate partnerships, the length of time that restoration takes, the range of approaches that we can take to restoration, and the importance of having the appropriate, I guess, so-called carrots and sticks or incentives and otherwise to ensuring appropriate restoration. So to get us started, I'm going to ask for some reflections from our panellists. So if I could each ask you to introduce yourselves a little more than that title that I've given the audience, and give us your, I guess, perspective or an overview of how you view restoration. Starting with you, Sarah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Super. Thanks. Thanks, Lyndall. Yes, so my name is Sara. I work with Sappi. For those of you that don't know, it's a large wood fiber company, so manufacturing pulp, paper, other biomaterials, and in the context in South Africa, managing land and forests or plantations in South Africa. So that's a little bit the backdrop and the perspective I bring to the conversation around restoration and the role of private sector. I actually think that private sector has a massive role, well, both an obligation, but also a role and opportunity for supporting restoration objectives globally. There's a lot of things that private sector can bring to the table in terms of technical capabilities, the knowledge on how to, propagate seedlings, R&D nurseries, silvicultural practices. We do a lot of outgrower scheme engagement with landowners and supporting on restoration and reforestation activities. And so, I think there's a lot that forest sector can bring in the scale up. And we had really fascinating discussions over the last couple of days around that. And I guess one of the areas that just to touch on in these introductory remarks is something that I pulled away from the scoping dialogue, but just I think all the participants came in with this view of restoration. And at the end, we had quite a diversity of views of what is restoration, which activities are in, which are out. And we kind of started to build and conceptualize this framework, this continuum of all these different types of activities and contributions that are restorative in their nature. And I think that's a really useful framing, that it's not just one thing or another. And we kind of argued and we're a little bit uncomfortable because we wanted definitions and metrics and really precise kind of Western science paradigm way of putting things in boxes. But then we also came to this conclusion that actually restoration is meaningful when it's in specific places with local stakeholders involved, and actually there's a massive diversity that needs to be recognized, because the flow of benefits and the needs from restoration are different in different locations. And I guess that, you know, from that kind of concept of looking at restoration just in terms of ecological restoration towards really thinking of the flow of benefits for society, for social issues, for and even employment and security, and as well as the economic, so from a development perspective as well. And I think that's where restoration is such a useful construct, is actually it can achieve and contribute to so many agendas when it's done in an inclusive way, in a way that's appropriate at a specific place. So yeah, just to share those kind of views. And maybe one aspect of my lens to the topic as well is just, since we're in this lovely building, as a graduate here from the Forestry School with a Master's of Forest Science, it's very much a pleasure to be back here. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. And passing to you now, Kerry, for your, I guess, reflection and perspective.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Lyndall. It is kind of funny to be on this side of the room, as I spend a lot of time myself as well sitting in the audience. I'm Kerry Cesareo. As Lyndall said, I am with WWF. I work for WWF US, which is part of the WWF network. So we work in over 100 countries around the world. Forest conservation is a huge part of our global strategy. It's the program I lead for WWF US. And we have multiple initiatives looking at holistically the conservation of forests, both protection and conservation, improved and sustainable management, and restoration. And I think the perspective or the lens and what attracted me to being involved in this global scoping dialogue is just the increasing realization that while it would be much more efficient to keep forests standing in the first instance, we don't have the luxury of following a pathway of, well, let's first conserve and then restore. We need to walk and chew gum at the same time. So we have to figure out how to incentivize and scale up restoration, but not at the expense of losing our focus and our attention on halting the loss and degradation of forests globally. So very much thinking about how we do that well. I think it was quite interesting as we grappled with some of these complicated topics over the past 2 days, because at one point, a fellow member of the Forest Dialogue Steering Committee said, well, of course, the only way we can talk through this is to go to a real place on the ground. All of these issues are contextual, and you have to kind of go through the forest or go through, be on the land and looking at that through the lens of a landscape in order to understand how to go forward. And we always need yes, that's the truth of it, and it's always good to be reminded of that. But then we also need to pull back out and say, how do we use the global frameworks, the policies, the momentum that exists around tree planting and the role of forests in climate, and the interests on the part of many actors, including the private forest sector? How do we link that up to ensure that the incentives are there to drive, what good looks like? And that's going to look different in different places, but it's sort of how to match driving things at the global scale in a way that connects with what needs to happen on the ground, and how to support the people doing that work, the landowners, indigenous peoples, communities, all of the actors in a way that helps us achieve our goals for people, climate, and nature. So I think that's where I'll stop.
Thanks, Kerry. And Ivone?
Thank you, Lyndall. Thank you all for coming to listen to us. I think my name is Ivone Namikawa. I work for Klabin. It's a Brazilian forest products company. And I would say that being a Brazilian forester means a lot in this world when we are talking about conservation and restoration. From the private forest sector, I would say also that we have a kind of influence in this era of restoration and conservation that goes beyond our fences. We used to say in the past that we had this responsibility inside our fences, but we need to go much more than that. And I will talk after about the experiences, but we can have experiences that come downstream and upstream. So the private forest sector has this opportunity using our knowledge around tree plantation and also the knowledge that we have nowadays around how we can run together conservation and production purposes, how we also can stimulate other sectors to be in these restoration purposes. I think the other thing that we have discussed during these 2 days, and I want to raise here, is how we can have actions at our landscape level, but also scale up and come to all this arena of different goals that we have globally and link these things in a way that each small goal that we are reaching in several places in the world is going to be part of these global challenges. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ivone. And now, Gamma, if you could introduce yourself and provide your perspectives. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Lyndall. Thank you everyone for coming. My name is Gamma Galudra. I'm the Indonesian country director for RECOF. Maybe most of you do not know about RECOF. Well, RECOF stands for Regional Community Forest Training Center. Actually, our headquarters is in Bangkok, and we are operate in 7 countries in Southeast Asia, including Nepal. And our work mostly focus on community forestry. Yeah, mostly about community forestry, promoting community to able to manage forests. This means including restoration. Yeah, one of our work at this point is about restoration, the forest landscape restoration. Yeah, and in our work in this case, we are trying to promote how social forestry, like social forestry, community forestry, able to restore, to manage the forest. Yeah, in this case, restoration. As I am from Indonesia in this case, yeah, and Indonesia right now facing a lot of problems in terms of degraded forests. Yeah, right now we've 5 years ago in 2015 we faced a forest fire, a big forest fire, and also because of this forest fire, the government tried to impose they already make some kind of a forest institution, or they call it peatland restoration agency, to restore about 2.2 million hectares of peatland restoration. Yeah, another two, maybe I'm wrong about the numbers, but I think about million hectares of restoration. Yeah, and 4 months ago, the government also tried to reallocate about 1.1 million hectares of forest in Java for social forestry. From 1.1 million hectares, around 475,000 hectares of Java lands are trying to be rehabilitated through social forestry. In this case, we see that the opportunity of social forestry to become part of this rehabilitation and land restoration. Thank you.
Thanks, Gamma, and thanks, everyone. So we've been talking a lot for the last couple of days. So now I'm hoping our panelists can do a good job of bringing the forest, bringing their real life on the ground experiences to us here in the room. Starting with you, Sara, we've heard, you know, from Laura just now, and we've spoken about it a lot. Whenever we read about restoration, it's all the benefits that it can bring from a climate perspective, livelihoods, biodiversity. And we keep hearing that we need to scale up. We have 2 billion hectares that we need to restore. But the practicalities of doing that on the ground are not straightforward. So I'm just wondering if you can bring to life for us a little bit, from your perspective, how we can scale up restoration to have meaningful impact. And perhaps you have an example from the field that you could share with us.
Yeah, indeed, there's a lot of opportunity there. And I think one of the ways, and Ivone, you touched on it a little bit, but in some of our discussions and ways of thinking about where scale up can happen, we were kind of looking at this concentric ring illustration of kind of where are the spheres of control that the private sector has to influence restoration or land management. But where are the spheres of influence, you know? And so when we look at our direct operations as a company, of course, you know, optimally those areas, and especially the plantations or the forest areas, are under sustainable forest management. So there we're not degrading the land, but actually keeping it in a good state. But of course, there's areas where attention is needed as well. So we've talked a lot already today about forest restoration, but I think our starting point needs to be wider around ecosystem restoration, because in the context where we operate in South Africa, where we need to actually focus our energy on restoration is in the grasslands. So there's not that much natural forest area in South Africa. So when we talk about restoration, we're not talking about trying to restore to forest, because that's not the natural ecosystem in most locations. We're actually talking about wetlands, we're talking about grasslands, and, you know, really key habitat area for a lot of species. And so, you know, an example within Sappi, in the lands that we manage in South Africa, there's areas of set-aside that we're managing as grassland, and there it's, you know, using controlled burning and other techniques to make sure that area stays open and those grasslands stay intact. We actually even have them zoned as protected areas to help also keep out other encroachment from mining or other activities as well. So I think there's a lot that you can do in your own, and a lot of obligation of things that you need to do in your own direct operations to make sure that you're really living up to the ethos of, you know, environment and social and economic sustainability in the land that we manage. But when I come back to this construct and these concentric circles, so then you look at kind of the value chain as the next ring, right? So this is where are we sourcing the wood from, and where are we sourcing other raw materials from in terms of our supply chain, or engaging our customers as we go further downstream in the supply chain. And I think within that space, there's also a lot of areas of influence and support where we can look to support landowners in restoration activities and set aside or improving degraded areas into more productive land uses. And then a third concentric ring is the landscape. So really beyond our, you know, direct needs and scope as a company. And that's, I think, one of the areas that in the scoping dialogue really came around as this is where the opportunity is for scale up. So it's really outside of the perhaps direct operations of the companies. There's all sorts of land uses, there's all sorts of stakeholders. And that's where there's, you know, obviously the opportunity to scale and the need for scale. And I think that's also where we all struggle with what's our role, what's our responsibility, how do we build long-term collaborations that you know, change some fundamental challenges that exist in landscapes. And of course, those challenges are different in every place. When I think of our kind of larger, it's a water stewardship project. It's essentially about restoration, right? So the issue there is water security, and the topic is about how do we manage this whole catchment area to optimize the use and the security and the availability of water. So that relates to pulling out an alien species or alien species removal. It looks at new approaches to cattle ranching to reduce erosion. all sorts of different interventions from a restoration perspective with an objective around water. And we do that work in collaboration with many local NGOs. And I think there's a huge opportunity there, and some of the challenges are also like, what's that sustainable financing model that keeps that work going in the future? Because I think the challenge with restoration is you can't turn your back on it. It's not something that starts and finishes in a lot of ecosystems. It's something that needs constant attention, constant intervention, constant support, and a transformation of practices as well. So I think, there's some good challenges that we have in scaling up, and part of that relates to finance, and another one relates to kind of institutions. So, whether that's the role of local government or other actors to play a convening or a catalytic role, other than just private sector, because I think we can play that role, but it's not necessarily a long-term option for us to be the only funder for these types of projects. So that's indeed one of our challenges. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. Building on what you've just said and talking about the role of other institutions, moving now to you, Kerry. You work at the global level, and of course there's these very large global goals that we've heard about today and are all familiar with. I'm wondering if you can provide that sort of linking perspective between the landscape level restoration needs with our capacity to sort of meet those global goals. And if you can, provide a perspective on the importance of getting the frameworks and the policies correct so that outcomes on the ground are appropriate and help us to actually meet those big goals.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And actually, it was a good tee up, I think, Sarah's examples, because I think it helps to start with a real world example of something that WWF is working on the ground with partners, and then thinking about how we kind of wrap around and support that through global frameworks and by working with other partners. So one of the places in the world that WWF US is working with other WWF partners and local partners is in the Atlantic Forest of Brazil, where we're working with WWF Brazil, landowners on the ground, and other local partners to do restoration in a number of sites. And it's an example of both, excellence on the part of those partners in terms of, from a scientific perspective, from the perspective of being driven by the local priorities. So, for example, there was extensive mapping and stakeholder engagement done to identify the sub-watersheds. And one of the places we're working in is in Mogi Guaçu within Sao Paulo State. And there was work done to identify the sub-watersheds that would be the most critical for providing water for urban areas, and then also working to identify those landowners who were interested in doing restoration. Particularly, there are family coffee farms in the area, and it was very interesting. I was down there in the fall and talking with the landowners just about the benefits they were seeing from restoration for their own businesses, but also for other, just in terms of returning water to the landscape. So within the span of a couple years of working with local partners, one of the organizations is Copaiba, to do restoration with a group of other coffee farmers, seeing the return of springs, of natural springs, seeing the return of bird life and other wildlife, and then seeing also sort of opportunities for marketing shade-grown coffee and some of the other attributes of that coffee, and getting into preferred markets and things like that. And also just sort of, I think, the meaning of those projects for these families that had held the land for multiple generations, and seeing the return of some of the qualities of that land that they had experienced as children. And I think looking at that example and sort of, I think, the way in which the work was done, the use of native seedlings from a local partner that had been working to build out a local nursery operation, a women-led nursery operation, so supporting small and medium enterprises in the region. I mean, it was very inspirational. And then you ask yourself, well, how can we ensure that those are the types of projects that we're supporting and driving incentives to support. So one of the things from a WWF US standpoint is that we work with a number of US-based companies who are both in the forest sector or who are reliant on forests for their business and are interested in supporting forest conservation and restoration. And so it's actually through support from International Paper and now Silvamo. They've now separated their business, as well as HP, that we've been able to bring additional resources to bear for that project. But beyond that, it's the importance of having those companies both advocate in the fora and settings that they're in to drive frameworks. And to be really specific about it, I mean, two I would cite. One is the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which is an initiative through which the targets of Paris are downscaled and translated into action that companies could take. So depending on what sector you're in and what your responsibilities are in terms of impact, both in terms of the need for decarbonization as well as your impacts on forest and land use, setting a target aligned with that. But there are a lot of rules and methods and things that need to be tended to and engaged on to ensure that targets are set in a way that drives action that's not just about carbon removals, but also, as I was alluding to earlier, about reducing footprints in the first place. So again, not sort of offsetting the impacts on climate through nature-based solutions, but really addressing the full scope of things. So WWF both works. So to give you the perspective, I've with colleagues in Brazil through WWF Brazil and local partners working at the level of how to support the restoration objectives of communities and landholders, working at the scale of our corporate partners, and then global frameworks that extend beyond individual corporate partnerships, but that are about impacting and influencing sectors as a whole. And then one other framework to mention is similar to how the Science-Based Targets Initiative has set out to guide corporate target setting for climate. There's an effort to set science-based targets for nature through the Science-Based Targets Network. And we're both engaging to ensure that those targets are workable and strong, but also anticipating what we expect that will look like so that we can start working now with companies to get them on the path as those targets come online and creating the incentives for why a company would seek to set such a target. So I think that's the role that we're trying to play is sort of covering that side of things, but it can only be done with partners, right? Like we can only do that through the strength of our relationships across our own, diagram of kind of points of engagement.
Thanks, Kerry. That was fantastic. Thanks. Moving again to you, Ivone. In your opening words, you talked about the need to work beyond our fences and that incredibly important juggle between conservation and production. And of course, there's been focus on the Brazilian Forest Code or Brazilian Forest Law and the intentions that it has around conserving, a particular percentage of lands. Can you provide your perspectives on that law, and particularly with the focus on restoration, and perhaps share with the audience what you think other countries might be able to learn from that law, and including any, again, on-the-ground examples that you might be able to share. Thanks.
Thank you. I think it's great to have the opportunity to talk a bit about the governance having in our country this law, the forest code or the forest law is something that we had for I don't know how many decades, but it was like revised, and we have this percentage of each of lands in Brazil that needs to be or with natural vegetation or needs to be restored if they were degraded in the past. And this kind of law or the governance that we have is pushing, the sectors to come to one place that normally the private forest sector in our country was already going to this kind of way, because as we use what they prefer to say the natural resources, even we plant our trees and we grow them and we harvest and replant again, even with this kind of business, this is one of the sectors that are like mostly people or society or even the governments. They are like trying to take care a lot, not doing bad things. So we use it to be like having good practices, good this sustainable forest management. But this was one of the ways that the governance and the law to also take this kind of management practices also outside the fences, like I said. So one of the projects or programs that we have that is very interesting is that we build a partnership with one non-governmental organization that was like specialized in landscape approach or trying to have a better land use in small landowners. They had this kind of experience. And then with this kind of partnership that we built, and this started like back in 2008, so it's something old and something before the Brazilian Forest Code, but we could build like a model where we have this organization, we have the landowners, or in our supply chain, because they are our suppliers, or just neighbors in the region that are invited by the company and NGO to have like, do you want to be fit to the law? So if you need to have the 20% of restoration, do you want to do that? Oh, if you want, we are going to provide you the technical assistance to do that. We are going to provide you the seedlings, and the seedlings are produced in this NGO nursery where we have, seed collection with technology, with the knowledge of genetics, what's truly important for the restoration process. And when we build something like that, and like you said, the partnerships are like an important part of the whole process. So I'm just trying to give one example of what can be done, and this kind of example also can help to scale up, because we are not working only with our suppliers, but suppliers of other chains, other products chain, like you said about, the coffee producers, or even farmers that produces soybean, corn, raising cattle, several other activities. And this is important because I would say the plantation, the tree plantation area in Brazil owns like, I don't know the correct number, but probably 80 million hectares. And we are talking about the possibility of improve the management of 200 million hectares, because this is the area where the other sectors, the agriculture, the production of meat is using in the country. And if we can be like the example for restoration in the areas that are managed by these other sectors, this is going to be wonderful. So this is a kind of thing that the private forest sector can do. Just very quickly also that we can also stimulate not only our suppliers, but also the customers. You know, we have like a big customer, worldwide company that wants to be reaching targets like SBTI or other targets, and it is part of their wish to do restoration. And in Brazil, we have in this Mata Atlântica, like you said, we have like a corridor that comes from the very southern part of the country to the northeastern. And this area is considered as a corridor, a good corridor for conservation. And in this corridor, this company, they want to do restoration. And then naturally, they came to us because we are a forest-based company. We know how to do restoration. And they said, how you can help us? And we said, we can help to structure the governance to have this kind of project. So we went trying to find some kind of big NGOs. I like big NGOs. So we went for some...
We do some things well.
Huh?
So we do some things well.
Yes, some things they do well. So we went for some big NGOs that could also provide knowledge of building this kind of partnership, but also some small organizations in the field, in the landscape, that could also do the real field work. And we brought this company to the project. So this is not a project that Klabin is running, but we are a kind of, how can I say, in this kind of chemical thing, we are like the enzyme that is working to make things happen. And I think this is our role too. So it's something a little bit different to bring as an example. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Ivone. So moving continents now across to Indonesia, but keeping very much with this topic of partnerships and reflecting on, I think, one of the strongest messages out of the last couple of days is that restoration is context specific, and how we go about it is local and context specific. So, Gamma, you work at the interface between private sector and the local community, and we have heard again and again that if, stakeholders and the local community aren't engaged with appropriately, it's unlikely that the restoration activity is going to be successful. So keen to hear your insights around partnerships, around work, bringing the private sector, large companies together to work effectively with local communities. And again, any case examples that you might be able to share would be fantastic. Thanks.
Thank you, Lyndall. I think one of the key messages when we talk about how we try to engage with local communities to get involved in the restoration is we should give them an opportunities in this case. Yeah, an opportunities mean that we can give them a better alternative livelihood programs in this case. Yeah, giving them better seedling, for example. Yeah, giving a better management maybe through agroforestry in this case. Better technology. Yeah, adopt better technology to them in this. Or maybe we can give them a better access. For example, if that's a state forest area, we can give them a better access, better benefits in this case. So if we want to have some kind of ensure the engagement of local communities into restoration, we give them opportunities in this case. But of course, the other part is about threat also. I'm not saying in this case threat, in this case meaning in a bad word. Yeah, I mean, the threat in this case is maybe about when we talk about degraded forests, sometimes it causes a disaster. Yeah, sometimes like forest fire, flooding, maybe dry, no water, for example. Yeah, so this will encourage the local communities to restore the land because of this threat. For example, in Indonesia, before just I mentioned in 2015, there's a forest fire, but people do not think about planting the trees. They don't want to think about that. But now, after the 2015, the local communities were thinking, okay, this is happening because there's a fire in this case, yeah, fire. So they are encouraged and then they're supported by the local government, to plant the trees in this case. But of course, there are other things that we have to realize, that forest fire comes to lack of knowledge or lack of technology, because sometimes forest communities use less and burn, yeah, because we cannot deny of the. We cannot deny by the methodology of fires to open to cultivate the land. I think it's very cheap, and people, local communities, that can be a way to cultivate the land. So this is also the importance of having a technology to them, the alternative technology, to ensure that the people do not use fires in this case to open or cultivate the land. Especially when we talk about the peatland area in Indonesia, because Indonesia is the largest peat forest in the world in this case. Yeah, so I think that's when we talk about engagement in this case about communities, I think I can easily classify it as opportunities and threat in this case. And what about the private sector involvement in this case? This is very important. Well, I think the important part is when we talk about livelihoods, we have to give them two aspects: access to finance and access to market in this case. This is a key role for the private sector to give them. The private sector need to give open access to the local communities to finance. Yeah, maybe bankable loan that can easy, or maybe a low interest, for example, that able, because sometimes because in Indonesia the interest rate is quite high, and not many local communities are able to fulfill the interest unless it's oil palm. It's oil palm. This is. I'm not saying oil palm is bad in this case, but sometimes it become monoculture. So it's create some problems. Of course, it's not all land can be planted by oil palm, but sometimes if it's profitable, all land are being planted by oil palm, and that is the problem. So this is also the importance of private sector to give access to finance and access to market, and also, for example, not all land, degraded land can be, for example, can be planted by agroforestry. Yeah, we can, for example, like the area in the peat swamp. Maybe it's quite limited to find agroforestry products that are profitable in this case. So this is also another alternative for the private sector to give a thought about. For giving some kind of a carbon offset, maybe, but I don't know in this case. So there's plenty of roles for the private sector to support the local communities in the restoration. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Gamma. Hold on to your microphone. Gino, I assume we can go a little over. So given we started a bit late, yeah? About 10 minutes or so over, is that okay? Yeah? Okay, I have a challenge for you. Before we move to Q&A, I really would like to get some super brief closing remarks, because I do want to take just 1 minute each to reflect on the title of this conference and give us some closing remarks, though, that look to the future. So the title of this conference is Envisioning the Future of Tropical Forests, the Roles of Feedbacks, Interconnectedness and Adaptation. So a very brief final remark before we move to Q&A on that title of the conference, but particularly as we look towards the future and restoration?
I think if you want to envisioning the future, when we have to remembering the past, I think that's the important part. I mean, we in Indonesia we have a lot of lesson learned of failure, maybe many failures, and we think we need to revisit that and how we can see the future, how we can restore the degraded forests. And then we see why this degraded forest happen. It's simply because we neglect a lot of things about local communities' roles. We maybe neglect the roles of private sector in this case. Yeah, maybe in the past there is no such thing of partnership. Yeah, in this case, and I think this is also in the future. For example, I think better partnerships between not only with the local communities and private sector, but also with the government. The government role is very important in this case. Yeah. Very important. We don't want the government make a policy that cause problems in this case. And in the past in Indonesia, I have to say this: the problem always comes, not always, mostly comes from the government. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Ivone. Some quick remarks.
I think talking about the future. I am going to come back to two important words that are production and conservation. If we envision a better future with restoration, we need to think that in this whole area where Laura said we need to restore, we need to think about production, but also think about conservation, because we need to check for the needs of the society. We need to check around the needs of communities, because we are not going to have better forest areas in the future if we don't think about people. And people are like part of this forest. So I think it's important to think about how we can reconcile conservation and production. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the thought I wanted to leave you with from my side was on the point of interconnectedness and feedback loops, that there's a lot of interest in restoration, particularly through the climate lens, but we need to be careful to not be looking at it solely through the climate lens or with an eye to optimizing only for climate, because of the connections and the feedback loops in terms of people, nature, and climate. And then I feel compelled to add that on the point of just thinking of the future, restoration is inherently an act of hope. It's all about the future. And so I think it's just such a timely topic in that context.
Yeah, I think it's hard to add to that, because those were similar themes that I was thinking on as well, and also in this context of moving towards a bioeconomy and how we can use restoration, similar to how Ivone mentioned, with the focus also ensuring that production and productivity is part of that continuum. Because I think the challenge that we have when we look at our society, when we look at the needs for materials, replacements for fossil-derived materials, expanding population, it's also excuse me, important to think about wood mobilization. So how do we grow the wood that can substitute other materials, that can also fuel bioeconomy development as an agent for also the sustainable development goals? So to me, I see this really nice feedback loop, not to say that all restoration should be about production forestry or managed forestry, no, but I think if we look at that as part of a mosaic and part of a continuum, we can really achieve so many things that we need to fix on the planet, including this shift to bioeconomy. So.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks all four of you. I mean, we're so lucky to have you, such rich, fantastic information. So we now have a few minutes for you to ask this wonderful panel some questions. So, Gino, you'll pass the microphone around. Yep, up here.
Hi there. My name's Elena Dick. I work for a company called Climate Focus. And I definitely agree with what Kerry was saying. The focus on forests and restoration needs to go beyond climate. Right now, however, but you're all talking about the need for more finance for restoration, finance for local communities. And there's a lot of finance right now in demand for carbon credits that are coming from restoration projects. So sort of, is there a role for that? How do you deal with the fact that that's a source of finance right now, that there's a lot of demand for that in the private sector? SBTI is still accepting those kinds of credits to some extent. So I'm just really interested in Kerry's thoughts, but everybody's thoughts kind of on that.
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question. I mean, I think there's a shift underway, given both, I think, concerns about perhaps some aspects of the voluntary carbon market. Obviously, I think probably most people in this audience are aware of various commentary on that. So I won't belabor that. But I think just thinking more broadly, the voluntary carbon market emerged before we ever had a Paris Agreement. And, there are just shifts underway in terms of the role of countries and thinking about jurisdictions and Article 6, et cetera. And I think if you look at, even just within the voluntary carbon market, where moves are going towards looking at jurisdictions, these are all things Climate Focus and you, surely know, that we need to be moving towards some expanded and diversified financing. Not to say that will necessarily replace all that exists in terms of the current voluntary market, but clearly, I don't see how we're going to get to where we need to go relying solely on the market as it exists now, particularly given the price of carbon. We can't do it well. This is, from the perspective of WWF. And so I think trying to think about how to more creatively pair the kind of appropriately match those projects that may be more conducive to climate finance with those projects and interventions in the broader landscape that are, they can't access that finance. And even more importantly, in the broader context of pairing, essentially blending finance, right? There's a lot of pressure, I think, for conservation projects to suddenly all become revenue generating bankable projects. And there's also this expectation that bankable projects are somehow going to deliver the same level of conservation and social outcomes that conservation and sustainable development projects have sought to produce for a long time, right? And I think I see these conversations playing out where everyone's feeling the pressure to sort of do the job on the same hectare. And I think there's a better way to be pairing and packaging those interventions and trying to bring together in a more integrated way using the landscape as a unit on that. So I think it's not that, all of these, we need all of the pieces, but they're not coming together in a way that's driving sustainability and kind of a whole, making the landscape whole. And so I think that's just something I think we got to be moving towards as a broader community, and it requires understanding the vocabulary and being able to cross boundaries in certain terms of the conversations we're having.
Thanks, Kerry. I neglected earlier to say hello to our online audience, so hello and welcome. And we have a question from Christian for Gamma. So Christian asks, what do you think regarding biodiversity in the government-managed plantations, Puram Patani? Is that how it's, yeah? In Indonesia. So what do you think regarding biodiversity in the government-managed plantations in Perhutani? Yeah. Just reflections on biodiversity in those plantations.
Okay. Well, I cannot answer about the biodiversity in this case. Yeah, I'm afraid that because I don't have the knowledge, I'm afraid that it it ends up with speculation in this case. I don't want to do that in this case. But for sure that just for the audience, I think Perum Perhutani is the state corporate, the state corporate that manage the state forests in the Java Island. Yeah. So as I mentioned before, that the government reallocate 1.1 million hectares of state forests from the State Forest Corporation, Perum Perhutani, to the government of Indonesia under social forestry programs, in this case, And I think, as I mentioned before, in this case, I think there's an opportunity that this can help as from 1.1 million hectares, nearly half of them are degraded forests. So there's opportunity for this to conserve the forest for biodiversity meaning in this case, but not the meaning as like a national park. So I think this need to be very careful to speak about in Indonesia, because sometimes the tendency when we speak about biodiversity, they are thinking in regulated way is about national park. It doesn't mean that way. It's also important for the biodiversity conservation. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Gamma. Another question from the live audience. Anyone else want to ask? Up the back here.
Hi, I'm Intu Budi Hartono. I'm from Indonesia, but I'm based at University of British Columbia. Just to add some information for the Indonesian case, I think the Perum Hutani or Perhutani also has, have to do like everybody else. So they do have like high conservation value area that they have to protect. So normally they're supposed to be doing the same thing as if it's another company who are with private sector. That's all. And I have a question for RECOF, basically, because you're talking a lot about community forestry. So what do you think about, because we know that community forest is different from different places to another places, right? Even within Indonesia, one island to another, they have a different concept of community forest. So what do you think about it? And because I work a lot with community forests in the Congo Basin and also in British Columbia. So I just like to hear a little bit about what RECOF do with the community forests, not just Indonesia, maybe, I don't know if you know a little bit about other parts of Southeast Asia. Thank you.
Okay then. Yeah, I think in terms of the community forestry, we in RECOF, we usually follow the regulations of the government, we follow the government regulation in this case, as they have different scheme in this case. For example, like village forest, community forestry. There's also people forest plantation. There is also there's 5 schemes in this case. There are also another schemes called private forest in this case, which is not. Well, basically, it's not under the social forestry regulation in this case. So, we mainly in Indonesia we follow that regulations in this case, including also in that scheme. There's also customary forest in this case, So we mainly follow the regulation by the state in this case, by the government. Despite that, there are some doubtful about how this social forestry actually capture all the traditional forestry management system in the ground in this case, This is my personal opinion, not take into account as a RECOF opinion, because I am a country director, so I have to be very careful about this. Okay, so there's mainly it's not all that can take into capture all of those systems, and this is a very worrying in this case, worrying, especially when we speak about customary forests, customary forests in this case, And I think this is, there's a need for the government to open a discussion about how those schemes actually, not only 5, but many more in this case, or maybe those schemes need to be adapted and adopted into a local locally way in this case. That's my opinion.
Thanks, Gamma. I have a big challenge for Sarah. I think it's for Sara, because we are running over time. I'm going to ask you a big question with a quick answer. So this is from Paolo, from our online audience again. How should, and if anyone else wants to chime in, you can to rise to the quick challenge. But I think it's for you, Sara. How should stakeholders create safeguards to prevent greenwashing and make sure that the serious projects are not put into the same bag of the bad ones? Sorry, I'm looking at you and saying, Sara, I'm so sorry.
I was like, Sarah's going to take this one.
Sorry. Kerry, gosh, sorry. I do know who you are.
So how are we going to prevent the good projects being...
Yeah, so how should stakeholders create safeguards to prevent greenwashing and make sure that the serious projects are not put into the same bag of the old ones? For you, Kerry.
Great, thank you, Lyndall. I think I'll highlight a few places in which work is being done on this and also some opportunities that are coming up. I mean, one thing is that a number of NGOs have come together to be clear that there's common agreement about, particularly on the issue of tropical forest credits, sort of what quality looks like. So I'd encourage anyone interested in who's interested in the lens of that through credits. It's called the Tropical Forest Credit Quality Initiative, TFCI, and you can go look that up online. WWF and others are a part of that. So I think there's been an attempt on the part of civil society to be clear in some of these spaces of what the expectation is, where we're trying to move towards, even if we don't have all of the pieces in place for that in terms of, what good projects are versus greenwashing. There continues to be updates in things like the Science-Based Targets Initiative. So recently there were methods released around forests, land use, and agriculture that didn't previously exist, which I think did allow for some confusion, the ability to set a target without considering one's footprint as it related to forests, land use, and agriculture. Now that will get phased in, and companies that do have impacts in those space will be required to update their science-based targets in line with those methods, and the greenhouse gas protocol is being revised accordingly. And then one other thing I'll mention, all of that doesn't necessarily resolve the issue around claims that are being made. There's a lot of expansive claims being made around in relation to being net zero or climate neutral or carbon neutral, and then in relation to forest positive, nature positive. In the US, one of the ways in which those claims are regulated or guided is through the Federal Trade Commission, and I would just note that the Green Guide is being updated, and there's going to be a call for proposals and input on that, and that does start to set some standards around what companies can say in terms of their green credentials. So I think it's recognized that this is a treacherous space even for companies, and I think we want to definitely weed out, we don't want to see greenwashing, but we also want to be able to support communications when good things are happening. So we want to make sure we don't overcorrect in that so that everyone kind of, puts their head down when they are doing good work.
Thanks a lot, Kerry. I'm really sorry, but we do now need to wrap up. You've all stayed way over time, and we really appreciate it. But I really appreciate this incredible conversation that we've had and the time that you've given us and the insights. We have been together for 2 days, but I mean, I've just learned an incredible amount more in the last hour. So thank you for sharing your extraordinary insights and on-the-ground experience. So I don't want to give long closing remarks, except just to pick up on the comment about, now I can't remember whether it was Sara or Kerry, about the hope for the future. But as I think that's a nice way for us to finish, and as you head into the second day of your fantastic conference. So thank you to Yale and the Forest Dialogue for inviting me to come and participate in this panel, and thanks all for joining us today. And I'll hand back to Gino. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, Lyndall. Thank you, Laura. I think we may head out to the reception conversation table. There's a lot to talk about, probably, and they are all gonna be there as well. So thank you so much for assisting, and we'll be in the third floor. Thank you.